The church generally seems to have accepted the critical text and seems to have accepted the NA 26, 27, 28, and will likely accept the 29th as it comes generally. So if we take a majority, not that a majority is a good indication of much of anything, but if we take that to suggest that that's the direction the church is going, then the church is accepting the critical text, and that becomes problematic for the idea that the church chooses the text or put your hands in the church.
There's a parallel in the King James only world, Dwayne. You have charitably tried to keep confessional bibliology and King James onlyism distinct. I did too, until I dug into it. And brother, I am not trying to be insulting. I really don't think there's a big distinction between the two. The distinction tends to be that the confessional bibliology folks are Reformed and therefore appeal to the confessions. The IFB, King James only folks, they're largely IFB. Obviously, they're not going to appeal to the Westminster Confession. But at heart, I showed in my paper for the Detroit Journal that they are saying basically the same stuff. I think that only the accidents and not the substance are really different. And what are they pointing to? They're pointing to God's providential use of a given text. And I wanted to say to the King James only folks for a long time, like, okay, now when does God's providential use of the critical text in the NIV, ESV, NASB, etc., to save countless souls, to have the Bible translated into many different languages around the world, when does that overturn your argument? Are you actually ready to appeal to the stats here? Because we can go do that. I don't think you are.
The way that I have separated confessional bibliology and King James Version onlyism was basically what you do with other language translations. So if you take the King James Version only movement, they would express, or many of them, like it's hard to pin King James Version onlyism down to one group because there's always nuances in there. Generally speaking, and if you don't believe this, then you're not in the generally speaking statement, but generally speaking, a King James Version onlyist would suggest that another language should have their translation done from the King James Version, whereas a confessional or a TR Advocacy position would insist that the translation of another language be done from the TR. So I think there's a definite place of authority. Now, they may get there via similar vehicle, but their conclusions are slightly different.
Tim Berg has worked hard on trying to make categories for different King James only views on the spectrum that its proponents, their proponents would actually accept. And I appreciate that. James White has a categorization that hasn't tended to get used, actually.
It's rejected by most people, yeah.
Yeah. My categorization would be, you're talking about the Ruckmanites, the folks who believe in double inspiration. But officially, the institutions that I was sort of connected with back in high school when I was in a King James only church, and by the way, I always say I had a good experience, I wasn't abused, good godly people who I just think were wrong about this, they were connected to institutions like Crown College, Ambassador Baptist College, West Coast Baptist College, Fairhaven Baptist College, Pensacola Christian College. I could go on a little bit. And all of those institutions, the official representatives of those institutions, the people who actually teach the Greek, they don't tend to teach Hebrew. They would all say, oh no, we are not Ruckmanites, just like the confessional bibliology folks say.
Right.
And I believe them. They say, we do not believe that the King James itself is perfect. So I think if King James onlyism is Ruckmanism, then yes, confessional bibliology is distinct from it, because they do consistently maintain that King James itself was not inspired. But the great majority, I think in order to do that, you have to cut out the great majority of people who consider themselves King James only, the people who were in that world that I was in high school. They're fuzzy on the details, but they're loyal to institutions and send their children to institutions that say they're not Ruckmanite. And if you take the great body of King James onlyists who are in that King James only mainstream, who themselves reject Ruckmanism, at least officially, the lay people might be confused about it often, they are saying the same things and appealing to a lot of the same authors, especially like E.F. Hills, as the confessional bibliology folks. I think that the confessional bibliology folks, I generally have an easier, how do I say this? Van Cleek and Riddle, they have good training, and I'm able to converse with them on that level. It is more difficult in the King James only world. I cannot think in the IFB mainstream King James only world. They don't have PhDs from Liberty or whatever school it was that Riddle went to. They're working on that, I happen to know, at least one institution, but that makes the conversation a little different. But again, I argue this in my paper. Major commonalities, huge overlap between the confessional bibliology world's arguments in behalf of the King James and the mainstream IFB King James only arguments for the King James.
I think one thing that we would agree on is how they come back to the King James Version leads me to think that functionally they are King James Version onlyists, right? I don't mean that in the sense that they're King James Version onlyists as a theological standpoint, but I mean that in the sense of what translation they prefer to use or think we should use. When I asked Dr. Riddle about this, I asked him about the New King James Version because that's the one I use, and so I'm looking to justify my use of that in their viewpoint, right? So Dr. Riddle, he kind of mentioned it in a sort of ho-hum kind of way. You could tell that it wasn't something that he would promote. When I asked him about others, he suggested the Geneva Bible might be okay. Actually, I should say he said it was a good one, but he always comes back to the preferred text being the King James Version, which is the same thing with Dr. Van Cleek. Yeah, Dr. Van Cleek just flat out said, I believe it's the King James Version for the English-speaking people. So
right,
it does seem,
text.
Yeah, so it is functionally a King James Version only thought. It just they go about coming to it in a different way.
This is where that third point from way back in our conversation was going to come in.
Yes.
I let it develop in too complicated a way. What I was trying to get at with saying that, okay, the scholars are going to be the ones who end up debating this, and it's going to end up being that lay people are going to trust one or another scholar or institution. If you cannot read Greek, this is not an insult. I hate having to say this as often as I do. You cannot speak with direct experience as to which texts are superior if you can't read Greek. I just don't see any way around that. And really, if you really want to be, full-orbed about it, you're going to have to say the same about Hebrew because there are textual variants in the Masoretic text tradition as well. So you end up with a situation where the TR folks are saying, we need to keep the Bible in the church and not in the hands of the academy. You've questioned that rightly, and so have I think, in this conversation, saying, well, the fact that the church, like including my church and yours, literally mine that I was in yesterday, yours that you were in yesterday, we have accepted and we think been led by the Spirit of God to use critical text translations on our part, and on your part, the New King James Version, which is still in the TR tradition but isn't the King James. So why doesn't the Spirit's leading of us count? Then there's this other factor. I want to say, okay, lay people, if you cannot read Greek, who should you trust? It's appealing to be told, you can know better than the scholars. 99.9% of the scholars out there are wrong, as, Michael Pearl recently said in one of his King James only videos. And that's effectively what Riddle and Van Cleek are saying too, because do you recognize, my dear brothers and sisters out there who are laypersons in the church just trying to serve the Lord faithfully, just wanting to know, okay, which Bible translation should I use? Do you recognize Van Cleek and Riddle and their group are in a tiny, tiny fraction of those who can read Greek and Hebrew? Why would that be? And can you really judge these matters for yourself if you can't read Greek and Hebrew? Okay, this is where I'm going with it. If you, in humility, have to acknowledge, no, I can't. I can't look at Greek manuscripts and make any determination about what family they're from or which one's right, which one's wrong, or both, whatever. Then what can you judge? And that's where my work comes in. I find that all this talk about textual criticism doesn't end up going anywhere with anybody. It ends up just being a lot. That sounds more dismissive than I mean it to. All the argument about textual criticism seems to me to often boil down to, still, are you going to use the King James or not? And if that's going to be the case, I kind of want to say I smell a rat here, because if there's a viewpoint that boils down to we must use a 400-year-old Bible translation, then I just want to say, okay, we've argued long about textual criticism. I don't think the Bible speaks with the clarity on that issue that my TR brothers do, but can we not all agree that 1 Corinthians 14 speaks with this clarity? Edification requires intelligibility, and both Riddle and Van Cleek, in my mind, have just gone like this with all my talk about dead words and false friends. Van Cleek has done a better job. He acknowledged, yes, there are, he said, some difficulties. I listened this morning on my way into work to make sure I just had it fresh in my mind. But he said, there are going to be difficult words, and I recognize that. That's hard for some people. But, you're just going to have to look them up. This is one of my tear my hair out moments. Like, brothers, how many times do I have to say it? How in the world are you supposed to look up words you don't even know you don't know? That's the whole point of a false friend. If their view boils down to, we all ought to stick with this one translation, like, again, I smell a rat, and lay people should too. If they're insisting you read a Bible in which I've documented over 50 words that occur several thousand times, and I've got it all counted out on my YouTube channel, that most people, even pastors, and I've seen this repeatedly, are going to be tripped up by. Ironically, one of those words is offend. I saw some King James only pastors being tripped up by that just several days ago.
Right.
If that's the case, something's got to be wrong. The Spirit of the Lord is not going to lead people to stick with a Bible translation that comes to be in further and greater tension with what the Spirit of God actually clearly said, which is edification requires intelligibility.
So now in talking about that, so we'll plug your book. So you've got Authorized, the use and the misuse of the King James Bible. So I ended up purchasing it on one of these things here. So I don't have a physical copy to hold up like you do. But I read it and I thought it was a great read. It was a fantastic read. Came at it with, I think, a lot of respect for the King James Version. You had a couple chapters in there.
Absolutely.
What we miss when we read the King James Version. And yeah, same here. I love it. It's on my nightstand right now. I'm going through it this year. Then you talk about your false friends. I don't think you had 50 in there. You just had a couple false friends.
No, I had about 35 in the book.
Yeah.
My next book is 50 False Friends in the King James. It's going to be entitled, Lord willing, King James Words You Don't Know, You Don't Know.
Well, there you go. An announcement. A new book coming out.
But I've done 50 on my YouTube channel. That's what I was
yes,
talking
you have.
about. Just
you
FYI.
have. Yeah, so I've also had a chance to take a look at some of the reviews of your book. So I'm going to ask you a question here.
Go ahead.
Get ready. Get ready. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
So some of the criticism leveled against this book has been, well, you talk about false friends, but when you're actually reading through the King James Version, there really aren't that many of them. So we could even take the example of textual criticism that there's probably more variance between, the various editions of the Greek New Testament. There's probably more of those than there are of your false friends. So how do you justify saying that these false friends are a bigger problem than what your critics seem to think it is?
Dwayne, you've hit right on what I even said in the book was, I think, the strongest argument against my viewpoint. In fact, my own pastor at the time, who's one of my great friends and I worked with smoothly, who shifted from the King James to the ESV during my tenure at our church. Our church recently closed. He moved back to the East Coast. We were just texting yesterday and this morning, in fact. Still friends. Anyway, he loves the Puritans. He loves the King James. And his thought was, yeah, I read your book and it's all good, but I come back to the King James sort of expecting, oh, wow, it's going to be really, really hard to understand, and it just isn't. I totally get that. I myself grew up on the King James and feel I can process it pretty well. I have several answers to this, however. If it's not such a big deal, like there aren't that many of them, they're not that serious for, causing misunderstandings, then why can't we revise them? Another answer comes from a man who did revise them. Noah Webster, 1833, put out, just several years after his, famous 1828 dictionary that a lot of King James onlyists, swear to, he put out Webster's, revised edition of the King James. And I actually have a video coming out on this on my channel, Lord willing, soon. I've uploaded it. It's ready to go. I've got it scheduled for a premiere. Don't know when this video is going to come out, so it might be out by then. But anyway, Webster named a bunch of the same dead words and false friends that I myself have talked about. And he basically gave all the same arguments I do. He himself said in 1833, so, roughly halfway between our day and the King James, he said, some people say that these aren't that serious. He said, they can be serious even in matters of less importance. And there are places, he said, where they are more injurious even to our understanding. So I think there is a range. There are passages where the false friends, hardly make much of a difference. I think my famous one, how long halt ye between two opinions, not a big deal. That you're missing out that halt meant limp back then. Sure, it's not changing any doctrine. But there are places, like in the New Testament, where that word offend comes up. In many things we offend all. We've got several different, English problems going on there. And are we really going to say it's okay to just let that static remain on those passages? And then lastly, I keep talking too long in these answers here, Dwayne. You're a great interviewer.
It's
pulling
okay.
all my thoughts out of me at the same time.
That's right.
I just want my King James only brothers, and in that I include my confessional bibliology brothers, because they are insisting on the exclusive use of the King James. They frown on the use of the New King James very consistently, okay? I just want them to make an honest accounting, a straightforward acknowledgement that there are X number of dead words and X number of false friends. And I would like to see them working as hard as I have worked to train lay people to read and understand these, not just to give them a list to stick in the back of their Bible or to go reference on a website, which they may or may not think to do, and in the case of false friends will not think to do. I just want them to teach lay people how to fish, as it were, as I've done. I would like to at least get them to face the question, how many dead words and false friends need to stack up in our traditional English Bible translation before it calls for change? So I've always said, the very first time a given word started to mean something different, like let's imagine that it was the word meat that used to just mean food, and now it's narrowed, semantic narrowing. Now it means the flesh of animals that we consume.
Right.
The very first time that happened, the first generation, let's just imagine that was in 1700, about 100 years after the King James came out. I'm not going to toss the whole thing out because of one false friend. Would it be time for a revision? Ideally, yes, but we know the sheep can't be shaken up like that. It's okay to let it last a little longer, but once we're up to dozens of dead words that even the King James Onlyists acknowledge, Trinitarian Bible Society has put out a huge list of these words, and then I'm arguing 50 or so false friends that occur several thousand times taken all together. Just tell me, when does that add up to enough reason for change? And the more I hear that, we got to have a standard sacred text, or that, the TR is the perfect, text, and so we got to stick with translations based on that. And the more I say, brother, then give me a translation of the TR that, matches 1 Corinthians 14. And the more I get my brothers in that world who are just dismissing wholesale everything I say, shifting right back to talk about textual criticism, the more I feel like I'm onto something. Riddle, in his review of my book, talked about one false friend. It's not a very long book. It wasn't hard to see. I talked about 35 of them. He talked about one, halt. He dismissed it. He said it's not important. Van Cleek, I believe, has talked about 2 or 3 false friends. He also, in my judgment, dismissed them, said they're not important. When I went back and forth with him a little bit on his own blog fairly recently, he said, you got to look up all the words in, as you do your Bible study. And I'm saying, brother, that's just not practical. And why bother when we could just revise it and put it in the hands of people in their own language? And you know what? It's actually already been done. Dwayne Green is using it, the New King James Version.
Right.
Repeatedly, after 4 years, actually today is the 31st, my book came out 4 years and 13 days ago. And not a single leading King James onlyist in the more IFB variety of it, or confessional bibliology world, has spent any time actually looking at more than one, and they barely looked at one of the false friends that I've talked about. I hope that doesn't sound arrogant. I'm just stating the facts. I have had a couple not leading King James onlyists, sort of a frenemy that I have gone back and forth with online, there's one guy who I think in the King James only world who has kind of tried to listen and evaluate and even push back in some cases. But at least he was listening. But the King James only worlds out there, IFB and confessional bibliology, have basically said, when they've looked at my case, the most charitable spin I can put on it is they've said, no, let's talk about textual criticism some more.
If we shift the discussion from the 50 false friends and what you see as kind of a big problem, and I would agree, I think this is a problem with the King James Version, but if we shift the conversation now to what I perceive to be the biggest problem for the critical text advocate is the number of Bible translations that come out because of revisions to the text. So the one that I pick on the most is the ESV, right? And don't get me wrong, the ESV is a great Bible translation of the critical text of Nestle Aland. I believe, I don't know which one it is that they're translating from, but I think it's gone through like 5 or 6 revisions since 2011, and then the New American Standard Bible is making some news lately because there's yet another revision, and then the Legacy Standard Bible of John MacArthur is kind of an extension on the NASB. And then there's, the English Heritage Version recently came out a few years ago, which is another Bible translation. When will that stop? That does need to stop. I mean, it seems to be a genuine problem that there's just so many English Bible translations out there. Like, what do we make of all that?
I have so many answers to that question. First, I want to acknowledge there is a problem, and I see at least 2 problems. I think I've written about this actually on the Evangelical Textual Criticism blog that Peter Gurry designed and runs. I wrote an article that was about the Legacy Standard Bible, and the title was "A Rising Tide Sinks All Boats." I think that a rising tide of translations, and especially when they come out from a niche like one man's ministry, John MacArthur, whom I respect and frankly. And
I thought you were going to go the Passion Translation there.
Well, that is one I'm willing to just outright dismiss.
I'm sure I'm going to get a couple angry people suggesting I shouldn't have put the Passion Translation after talking about MacArthur's LSB.
Look at Mike. I just send people to Mike Winger and all his talk with Doug Moo and Craig Blomberg and Nijay Gupta and multiple others. He's done a great job on the Passion Translation.
He's done fantastic on the TPT for sure.
Oh,
the
yeah.
Toilet paper
and
translation.
He's trying to be gracious, but even he's just like tearing his hair out. Can we leave that one aside and talk about translations that might actually get used among...
Yeah, we will acknowledge right now that there are some horrid translations, okay? We're not talking about those.
Right. Let's talk about the ones that actually make it onto, through all the vetting processes, onto the sort of standard Christian bookstore shelves. I'm sorry if the Passion Translation makes it there. It shouldn't. I don't know. We don't even have a Christian bookstore in this area, so I haven't checked for quite some time. But, we're talking about the ones that I always talk about. The New King James, the NASB, the ESV, the CSB, Christian Standard Bible, the Net Bible, the New Living Translation, the New International Version, and there are some iterations of those. So the NASB comes out in the 2020, and still they said they're going to make it available in the 95. We're not talking about 100 translations. We're not talking about 400. Right. We're talking about 10 max. So let's limit it to that. But I even said the rising tide is sinking all boats, because I do recognize that we've got to care for the sheep and steward their trust in the good translations we have. And the more we put out that make it look like John MacArthur, tweaked this to make sure it's complementarian and reformed or something. And people have said the same thing about the ESV. Now, I don't think that's true. But the more it looks like that to a watching world, even of Christians, the more I recognize the overall level of trust in Bible translations is going to go down. I do think that's a problem. I sort of live in neutral territory. I'm literally standing in the offices of Faith Life right now. Of course, I don't necessarily represent them in all my opinions here, but because we consider ourselves sort of an arms dealer for the evangelical world, we'll put out anything in Logos that benefits Bible students, even if, we personally disagree with it. That's sort of meaningless because there's so many people that work here. Okay, I can stand here in my neutral territory and say, publishers out there, please stop. The other problem I acknowledge is that I do think money plays a role that isn't entirely healthy in this.